We've come to the end of our disappointment series before we start a new one, and this one's called He's Right There. We find ourselves in Luke 24, another familiar story with the two guys that were walking on the road to Emmaus after Jesus had died and was now resurrected. These guys were talking and discussing all the things that had taken place, and Jesus had told all these guys what would take place, but these guys had not understood, and therefore they were discussing it. And once again, Jesus pops into the story by walking along with them. He asks the guys what they're talking about. And the guys are dumbfounded that Jesus doesn't know the news of the day. They assume he must be a visitor. So they start to tell Jesus how the Messiah was crucified and how they had hoped he was going to be their Redeemer. But it's now been 3 days, and they did hear that he's alive. But Jesus listened and called them foolish and slow of heart. And he tells them about Moses and the prophets and how it was necessary for Christ to suffer and die. So let's stop here a second. Hadn't these guys already heard the history about Jesus' birth and death on the cross? So why did Jesus call them foolish and slow of heart? In this context, fool means lacking understanding, and to do so because of their own self. Jesus himself had taught them and told them what would take place, and he was standing right there alive by them, but they didn't believe. They thought the resurrection news was nonsense. And why had they heard Jesus teaching and yet found themselves disappointed in everything that took place? So let's place ourselves in the story. We're told in scriptures that we will have tribulation and trials in this world, that the trying of our faith will work patience and all sorts of good fruit. But don't we too, when the actual trials come, walk down the road shaking our heads in disappointment and God not healing, not providing, not answering? We forget that he said he had overcome the world, that he would be with us, never leave us, that he carries our burdens and all the things. We too are foolish in our reaction to hard things. The followers of Jesus apparently wanted what Jesus told them that would happen not to happen. They still wanted their Messiah to be a king and be kingly, not die a sinner's death on a wooden cross. So their disappointment caused their eyes to be blind so much that they missed the resurrection right beside them. The end of the story Jesus had already told them, that he would rise again and live. Disappointment in God causes us to miss what transpires as we wait and believe in faith. The two guys did invite Jesus to stay the night, and it was Jesus that took the bread and broke it in the home where they stayed, and their eyes were opened. I heard recently that was an odd occurrence because Jesus entered this home and broke the bread. Usually the host of the home would do that honor. He blessed the bread and broke it. Remember, he did that at the Last Supper as well. Maybe they recalled that. And their eyes were opened, and then Jesus disappeared. And this time the two guys talked about something different, and they recalled how their heart burned when Jesus was walking by them on the road. They said that Jesus opened the scriptures, and they returned and told the other guys that Jesus was indeed alive. In other words, he was alive just like he said he would be. Imagine that. Jesus then appeared to all of them and said, "Peace be to them," and he showed them his hands and feet and asked them if they had anything to eat. And while he was speaking, they were both marveling and disbelieving for joy at the same time. When we live through a trial, we grow through it over time, and we come out the other end and realize God really was with us. He opens our eyes in our disappointment and speaks to our heart and reveals himself to us. Then we marvel at his goodness, and we can't believe how it all came together for good. However, deep disappointment can keep us from seeing Jesus in those moments. It can keep us from hearing words of comfort and truth, and it can keep us from experiencing his goodness in the hard, his resurrection power in the presence of death, and in his truth that sets us free. Jesus reminds the guy of the scriptures, the foretelling, the exact fulfillment of everything that was written, and it says their minds were finally opened. He blessed them, and the guys worshiped and were filled with joy. Of course, the followers of Jesus were disappointed when he died because their grief overtook them. They had lost their best friend. They saw him treated horribly. They were afraid while they watched. Their minds were so full of what they saw that they could only feel disappointed and question everything they'd been told. And of course, we're all disappointed when we're told to wait, when Jesus apparently shows up too late, like Mary and Martha's story, when we fished all night and caught nothing, when our path takes a turn that we didn't plan, like Mary, or when we've even read the Word and realized that we're in the middle of a trial, we're completely overwhelmed with pain and the reality of the moment. But what we do next and what we realize is so important. Jesus always shows up to reassure, reaffirm, and even reprimand us at times. He called these men foolish just that they lacked understanding. And He knows that we won't understand, that we will think thoughts and ponder and wonder. He knows us, He knows our thoughts, and He knew what those guys were thinking, but He wanted them to say it out loud to Jesus, and that's why He asked them. He wants us to pour out our hearts while we're walking on the road, right in the middle of when we think all is lost and everything we believed isn't true. Jesus then shows up, takes charge of hosting a meal and serving us bread and filling us with wonder and awe again so that we fall down in worship and joy. I remember wondering if what I'd been taught was true about giving and receiving, about protection and provision, when God didn't answer with a yes, and sometimes I've been afraid and fearful. God has always shown up on my path of disappointment, walked beside me, listened to my cries, and pointed me to Him again. Pain and grief and disappointment all wrapped up in hurt, and it lasts and it hurts deeply. It can wreak havoc on our minds and hearts, but the truth is that Jesus is right here. He said pain would be present in the world, but He also showed us that He's never too late. He always has a plan. He performs miracles and wonders. Death never has the final word, and when it appears that all is lost and hope is gone, He's right there on the road where we are, revealing Himself to us again in power, the power of life after death, that mystery that never disappoints.